Senator from Ohio.
Thank you. I am so amused at how any of my Republican colleagues can talk about that this is a legitimate process, that they wanted Democratic support. I sat at the White House with Senator Wyden, with Senator Cornyn, with Senator Toomey, a number of probably 11 or 12 Republican senators on the Finance Committee, 6 on the Democratic side on the Finance Committee. And I went up to the president. I had a copy of 2 bills in my hand. I brought it up to the whole group, the Patriot Corporation Act, on which I will speak in a moment, that does exactly what President Trump wants to do. You reward corporations that pay good wages, that pay decent benefits, and that keep their production in this country. And the president said he liked it. He had an interview with either Forbes or Fortune magazine not too much earlier talking about it. And then I brought up to the president the Working Families Tax Relief Act, which puts money directly in the pockets of people making $25,000 and $50,000 and $75,000 a year. The president said he liked that, but you know what happened? He said it then. He said it in a phone call that a group of us were on a little bit later. But you know what happened, Mr. President? You know exactly what happened. They all went down the hall here to the Majority Leader's office, all my Republican friends. They walked into that office. They had their Wall Street lobbyists with them. They had their drug company lobbyists. They had their tobacco company lobbyists. And that's where they wrote the bill. There was no light of day on this. And then my colleagues on this committee tell us that it was a legitimate process. The night we had the markup in Finance Committee, if you call it legitimate, you give us a bill with almost no warning. You try to jam it through, you change it in the middle of the night, then we talk about the next day, then you change it in the middle of the night again. You add a health care provision that the Congressional Budget Office said 13 million people will lose their insurance. Rates will go up, premiums 10% a year. If you're paying $500 a month today, you'll pay $550 next year. You'll pay $605 the following year. You'll pay $660 something a month the following year. I mean, don't even insult us by saying this is a legitimate process. But I don't even want to talk about the process because that really doesn't mean much to people. This letter that my friend mentioned, the first line is, we're writing to express our interest in working with you with bipartisan tax reform. That's what Senator Wyden said. That's fact. Look at it if they'd like to look at it. Mr. President, I want to talk about my amendment, which is exactly what candidate Trump campaigned on, exactly what pretty much everybody on this side of the aisle stands for, but most importantly is exactly what the American people have asked for. It's simple. It's called the Patriot Corporation Act. If you do the right thing, if you're a company that pays good wages, that provides decent health and retirement benefits to your employees, and you do your production in the United States, you get a significant tax break based on the number of employees you hire, a significant tax break. President Trump said he liked that. He told Forbes he wanted a bill with economic development incentives for companies. He has said repeatedly, the president has, that I want legislation, I want a tax bill where we support companies that stay here and are patriotic, and he said we penalize companies that don't do their production in this country. This bill now, comments from my friend from Pennsylvania notwithstanding, gives a massive permanent tax cuts to large multinational corporations as it gives them more incentive to move offshore. The presiding officer grew up in the Cleveland suburbs. A plant shuts down in Cleveland or Garfield Heights or Mansfield, where I grew up, it moves overseas, it gets a tax break now. Don't you think we should fix that? Instead, this bill greases the wheels to send more jobs overseas. Of all the things that we should fix, Mr. President, that's it. That's what the president wants to do. That's what Senate Democrats want to do. Instead, Senate Republicans, again, that deal was cut back there in Senator McConnell's office. Senate Republicans are writing a bill that gives huge tax cuts to the wealthiest people in this country. The Center for Budget Priorities just yesterday came out with, this was done precisely according to the numbers. 27% of the Bush tax cuts went to the top 1%. I thought that was too high at the time. 27% of the Bush tax cuts in 2001 and 3 went to the top 1%. This bill has more than double that, 60+% of the benefits. It's not going to mean a tax break for the middle class. They know that when they say that over and over and over. In addition, it kicks 13 million people off their insurance. We know that. This bill, let me say it this way. Under this bill, a U.S. company would pay a rate of 20% on profits earned at a manufacturing plant in Akron, Ohio. Or that same plant could shut down its plant, lay off those workers, build a new factory in Asia, get a tax deduction for the cost of moving, and you know what they'd pay? They'd likely pay 0% tax rate. So what are they going to do? 20, even in the Senate Finance Committee, where people are not as quick as you might think they are, 20 is a larger number than 0. Even we can figure that out, Mr. President. So at 20%, what's that mean? It means there's even a greater tax incentive to move overseas. Look at the community. The presiding officer knows Cleveland well. He knows I live in a neighborhood, Cleveland, Ohio, with my Connie Schultz and I, my wife and I. In our neighborhood, zip code 44105, there were more foreclosures in my neighborhood in the first half of 2007 than any zip code in the United States of America. You know why? It wasn't the Wall Street scam that caused so much foreclosure later. It was mostly, Mr. President, about lost manufacturing jobs. And you know why that is? It's partly because of trade agreements like NAFTA and PNTR with and other trade policy, PNTR with China and all that. But it was much about tax legislation, giving incentives to move overseas. So why are we doing more of it, Mr. President? This bill now rewards companies for sending jobs overseas. Our legislation, the Patriot Corporation Act, will work to keep jobs here. We know these corporate tax cuts are not going to end up in the pockets of ordinary working Americans. Senator Hatch and I had a very public discussion in the Finance Committee a couple Thursdays ago when the bill was voted out. And one of the things we talked about was a number of things we talked about, but one of the things we talked about is this promise, this assertion, this myth that if you give a company a big tax cut, then you know what they're going to do? They're going to hand it out to their employees. They're going to get a $4,000 or $5,000 or $6,000 or $7,000 a year raise. Well, that doesn't happen. That's never happened. When this body passed a tax holiday a decade plus ago, the money that was brought back from overseas at a low tax rate, that money went to executive compensation. That money went to stock buybacks. That money went to dividends. Almost all of it. Workers didn't get raises. They didn't invest more in our economy. Companies are sitting on large numbers, large stacks of dollars now, huge caches of cash. And those companies, they could hire more people now. They could raise wages now. They're not doing any of that, Mr. President. So what we ought to do here, instead of shoveling more money to the top, to these large corporations that outsource jobs, what we ought to do is cut out the middleman, put the money directly in the middle class. If my friends here want to give a tax cut to the middle class, why don't we give a tax cut to the middle class? Why don't we directly put the money there? I know the president said he's a big loser on this bill personally. It will cost him zillions of dollars, whatever he said. We also know that's not even close to true. But if we want to do this right, if we really care about the middle class, I ask my colleagues, let's give a tax break to the middle class. Think about it. They're not even hiding what they're doing here. These cuts go to corporate stockholders. They don't go to raise wages. They go to executive compensation. They don't go to create jobs. They go to stock buybacks. They don't go to middle-class Ohioans or middle-class Oregonians or Texans or Pennsylvanians or Alaskans. We know what will happen. And then you know what will happen then, as Senator Rubio said, after we pass this bill, the president signs into law, the budget deficit explodes again. You know what will happen? Senator Wyden knows this. He'll come back. And you guys will all say, you know, we got this budget deficit. We're going to have to raise the Social Security retirement age. And you know what that means to a barber in Garfield Heights? You know what it means to a construction worker in Warren, Ohio? Or you know what it means to somebody that's working in manufacturing in Mansfield, Ohio? They can't work till they're 70, but we can all work till we're 70 if the voters allow us, because we got these jobs. Well, a lot of our constituents can't, and if that's the scenario, and that's almost inevitable, we do this bill, we pass this bill, big tax cuts for the wealthiest people in this country. We drive a hole in the budget deficit. We come back and make the middle class and working families pay to fill that hole. That's irresponsible. That's morally reprehensible, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Leader, Mr. President.